Welcome back. The House Oversight Committee will pick up its investigation into Joe Biden's mental fitness this week and the use of the auto pen. Former White House Deputy Assistant Andrew Bates will sit down for an interview on Friday. Also testifying this month, former White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, along with former White House Chief of Staff Jeff Zients. Joining me right now with a status check of his investigation is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Kentucky Congressman James Comer. Mr. Chairman, good to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Maria.
What are you expecting to hear out of Friday's interview, and can you give us a status check on where you are in this investigation?
Yeah, well, these are the last three that we have scheduled transcribed interviews for. We may expand it, but thus far we're going to have interviewed close to a dozen former Biden staffers, high-level staffers. I mean, these are from chiefs of staff, the White House spokespeople, and what we're trying to determine is whether or not Joe Biden had any idea who was using that auto pen and what was being signed with his name on that auto pen. And thus far, Maria, we haven't gotten a lot of evidence that would suggest he had any clue as to what was going on. And the reason this investigation is important is because all of these pardons, the thousands of pardons that were signed with the auto pen, as well as the legal documents like the executive orders that were signed with the auto pen, these are all in question now. And I think that this investigation will go a long way in determining whether or not President Trump and the courts can declare all of those pardons and executive orders null and void.
So do you have a sense of what was going on in the Joe Biden White House while he was seeing his memory decline and his overall health decline? Is that what you have taken away from this?
Yes, and you know, we had the doctor in, Dr. O'Connor. We asked him a simple question: were you ever told to lie about President Joe Biden's health? And he pled the Fifth Amendment. I mean, he couldn't even answer that question. So we brought in a lot of people that we know used the auto pen. They were the ones who physically put the documents and hit the power button to sign Joe Biden's name. And they never saw Joe Biden. The president never said, here, sign my name on this auto pen or whatever. So we're trying to find who that person was that started this chain of events that resulted in documents being signed with the auto pen. We had Ian Sams, who was a huge critic of me during the Biden investigation, who was a huge critic of the Hur report, who would go on TV constantly and say he spoke with Joe Biden and Joe Biden's at the top of his game. He said under oath he only spoke, physically met with Joe Biden, looked him in the eye, spoke to Joe Biden 2 times over a 2-year period. But yet he would go out almost on a daily basis and imply to the world that, yeah, I've been with President Biden and he's at the top of his game. So there was clearly a cover-up of Joe Biden's mental decline. What we're trying to get down to is the specific instances when Joe Biden's signature was used on the auto pen. And just last week, Maria, there was a letter that surfaced from the Department of Justice, from the Merrick Garland Department of Justice to the White House saying, look, you can't use that auto pen on legal documents. So they were warned from their own Department of Justice about overusing that auto pen, yet they continued to do it.
Unbelievable. So, I mean, when you look at what has taken place here, do you see criminality? Is there anything we need to know that we're not aware of in terms of criminality?
I don't know about criminality, but I will tell you this. If documents were signed using Joe Biden's signature and Joe Biden had no idea what was being signed, had no knowledge of the person who was using the auto pen to forge his signature, then I think those documents that were signed, and we're talking about thousands of pardons and many executive orders that are being used to hurt Donald Trump in court right now. A lot of those executive orders in the lame duck period were to Trump-proof this administration. So I think that, you know, what we're focused on are the legal documents used with the auto pen and whether or not Joe Biden knew what was going on. Thus far, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that he did.
I want to move on, but this is my final question on this subject. So are you saying that there is a chance that those documents, whether it's an executive order which hits policy and impacts American people, or whether it's the pardons, are they not legitimate?
I haven't seen anything that would suggest that they were. I think they're in peril right now. And I think that these last 3 witnesses that we're bringing in for transcribed interviews, they better produce some hard evidence to make everyone on the Oversight Committee think that Joe Biden knew exactly what was going on, or else I think that all the pardons and executive orders, especially the ones during the last 4 or 5 months of the Biden administration, I think they're all in peril.
So then it could be that the pardoning of, for example, Dr. Anthony Fauci is not legitimate.
Exactly. That's correct.
Okay. Because this could lead you into all sorts of other investigations.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the fact that there's a letter from the Merrick Garland Department of Justice to the White House saying, you know, you can't use the auto pen on legal documents, and they continued to do it thousands of times after that, like they were in a mad dash going out the door, what some people would say, burning it down on the way out. I think that that's even more evidence that would suggest that the overuse of that auto pen probably wasn't the best legal route for the Biden administration to go.
Wow, that is incredible. All right, let me move on to President Trump confirming that he will deploy the National Guard troops to Chicago soon to crack down on crime. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker is saying there's no crime emergency, and he's vowing to fight the president every step of the way, even though 8 people were murdered just this last weekend. At least 50 others were wounded in shootings over the Chicago Labor Day weekend. Mr. Chairman, your committee is planning to advance several bills next month to back the president's federal takeover of Washington, D.C. What's next?
Well, I think we're seeing great success here in Washington, D.C. At the very least, we're seeing it is possible to control crime in these cities with runaway crime. You just have to get serious about it. And President Trump's serious about it. And I'll have to brag on Mayor Bowser. She hasn't done anything to obstruct President Trump's effort to put the National Guard on the ground here to eliminate essentially all the massive crime that we had in this city. I think that can be replicated in other cities. I don't take pleasure in having to send the National Guard into cities to control crime, but what we've got is runaway crime. And people like Pritzker and other liberals that live in nice neighborhoods, they should be forced to live in the bad parts of their cities for about a week and see if they change their attitude on having a National Guard presence there.
All right, and then on to the business at hand with you all and your colleagues back from your August recess. You've got 13 legislative days left for the month for Congress to prevent a government shutdown. House Speaker Mike Johnson putting the ball in the Democrats' court over it. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, however, is telling his colleagues that the Trump administration is provoking a standoff by moving forward with the rescission plans. He writes this: "It is clear that Republicans are prioritizing chaos over governing, partisanship over partnership, and their own power over the American people." Mr. Chairman, your reaction to Schumer?
Well, look, the Democrats don't want to cut anything. They don't think there's one penny of waste in the federal budget. And to President Trump's credit and the Republicans' credit, we realize there are massive amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. So, you know, the Democrats aren't going to do anything to help President Trump. I strongly encourage my Republican colleagues to stick together. None of us are going to like 100% of what this spending bill is going to look like, but we need to support the president. We don't need to shut the government down, but we need to continue to focus on waste, fraud, and abuse. The Democrats aren't going to help us with any of that, but Republicans are going to have to govern, and hopefully we can get that done by September 30th. All
right, we will leave it there. Congressman, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Chairman James Comer.